And look, Adam's not muted.
It worked this time.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm glad when things work.
Thank you. And by the way, I can see your mic, Brent. Your mic is showing.
Wow, it's
you got a little
Friday.
edge there.
It's Friday, y'all.
It's been a week.
I know, right? So, what are we gonna do today? What's today all about?
Well, if I recall correctly, it's reInvent, and we've announced some pretty awesome features, new services, just in the containers org. Forget outside of the containers org, which there's been a ton of amazing, awesome releases. But I think we're going to highlight some of what we announced this week today, right?
Yeah. So let's welcome everyone. Oh wow, Justin is like at reInvent on stage or something.
Oh,
I just caught that. That's so.
You should
awesome.
pace back and forth as you talk to make it more efficient.
So here's what we're gonna do today. Let me show
Keynote
you.
More realistic.
And you need to wear
more realistic.
You need to wear colored shoes with white soles.
Yes, black shoes, right?
Black shoes. Yeah, that's right. Black shoes, white soles.
I wasn't aware of this requirement.
Yeah.
This was my first reInvent. So, I mean, my first one attending. I've always caught them as a customer after the fact, but I've never actually been to one in person.
It's exhausting.
I hear.
I just, oh man, I just can't even imagine like I can't remember what it was like the very first time. It's just fantastic. So
I just one quick, one of my favorite memories of reInvent, and this is sarcasm, but like when I'd have a talk at like the Mirage, and then 10 minutes later I'd have to be at the MGM. So I'd either be running down the strip or getting in an Uber and just making it on time. It was always fun.
Oh man. Yes.
That's the reInvent experience.
The taxis are so good compared to Uber or the buses or whatever. Like those taxi drivers, if you got in like in that situation, I would usually get in and just slip a 20 in that little, window, and I'd be like, I have to be at MGM in 10 minutes, and the driver would turn around and be like, what? And then he would make it happen. So
it's like the movies.
Yep. It was awesome. You can't do that with anyone else.
Like in reInvent in person, do I have to change out of my PJs? I mean, that's what I want to like. This is kind of set the bar this week. So
if you're going on stage, yes.
But technically it's Vegas. So yeah, if you're not on stage, hey.
Right.
Go nuts.
What if I get some sweatpants that look like jeans? They're like,
That's the best.
So I'm gonna have to tell you guys the full story on this after the show, but I will say that there's a funny story about someone that I knew that always wore a hoodie, and he had to go someplace really fancy once, and so he ordered a suit hoodie. So it was like a full suit, but still hoodie, jacket, top. It was awesome.
That's pretty awesome.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. All right, let's talk reInvent. Let's talk announcements. Let's recap what's new. What caught your eye? So I don't know. I know Adam, Nathan, you guys, you love talking about ECS and running containers in the AWS ecosystem. Jesse, Justin, you guys love talking about EKS and Kubernetes and all that stuff. And we've had tons of announcements for both. So what caught your eyes?
I did just want to point out real quick, this is week 1 of 3 for reInvent. There are still more talks to watch for next week. So your point to ECS Anywhere, I don't think Massimo's main demo is I think next week. So it's like he has a talk on it that hasn't even shown up yet. So a lot of people there are things we're talking about that if you haven't seen any sessions or if the sessions haven't aired yet, we're trying to fill in some gaps here of what was announced in the keynote on Tuesday and what sessions you've seen or let us know in chat if there's something specific that you wanted to know more about.
That's right. Yeah, totally.
I think the thing that brings the whole container services worlds together in one new announcement are the anywheres or the anywho's, as Corey Quinn says. So ECS Anywhere, EKS Anywhere. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
You just want to talk a little bit about it?
Tell me about EKS Anywhere.
EKS Anywhere? Or
Yeah,
yeah,
EKS
they're both
Anywhere.
X. You pronounce them both X. They're both X Anywhere. Actually, Justin's been working on that actively. I'll pass it to him.
So with EKS, we announced two things specifically around the EKS distro, which is essentially taking EKS pieces and letting you run the EKS actual like API server and controller manager and the things that we package and run in EKS. We're now vending and allowing people to take those bits and run them anywhere they want with whatever installer they want. That was announced and is actually available now. So if you like using COPS or if you like using kubeadm or whatever your installer is that you want, you can totally take the bits, go and run it yourself.
Nice.
Next year, we will have our own installer around those bits. And so that we can install and manage Kubernetes in a more EKS native way, the way that we run EKS. So right now we're the server, the API components and stuff like that. Those are all the things you have now, but you're up to your own to get the installer and how you configure it, that sort of stuff. EKS Anywhere is around making the full EKS experience in your own data center or wherever you're trying to run it so that you can actually get, EKS integration a little better. Things work if you're in AWS and on-prem. Some of those expectations around config is going to be the same and functionality should be roughly the same depending on where you're running it. So those are kind of the two pieces for the EKS. Right now, distro is available. Next year, we'll have those installer bits and EKS Anywhere for managing the actual clusters.
Why would someone want to run EKS Anywhere outside of one of our normal regions and availability zones?
So I come from an on-prem background in animation. My first experience with Kubernetes was on-prem. We did bare metal. It was a lot of work to stand up and manage and maintain and upgrade and version, like, okay, which version of this component do I need for this version of this thing, and figuring out all the hardware. There was just so much complexity to it. It took me, I think it was 3 months before I got the cluster like up and running. I could deploy a job to it. And then I had to figure out like, okay, now how do we upgrades? How do we do this other stuff? And so EKS Anywhere really gives you a vended solution, right? It's a supported solution that's, hey, if you're in Amazon, I also have on-prem, I want to do hybrid cloud, whatever it is, you can get support from Amazon to run our EKS Anywhere on-prem and get that support, get the familiarity, and also get integrations with upstream, the EKS in Amazon. If we want to do things like, the new dashboard is available. Those sorts of things are integrations that we'll be able to easily do because we know how the cluster was configured, and we can help you with managing which versions of plugins, which I know Jesse will talk about, managed add-ons. These are all things that we're trying to make it easier to operate the clusters. And EKS Anywhere is really just that packaging of all of our knowledge of running so many Kubernetes clusters and bringing that to whatever data center you're in.
Nice.
Now, I already know a lot of people are going to be asking, like, well, what about the etcd? What are we going to do about that? Because the distro is the one thing. What about the etcd? Do you know if that's going to be like part of the second wave of EKS Anywhere?
So right now with distro, when we deploy it with COPS creates EC2 instances and it runs etcd on there. So there is a state store somewhere. But yeah, you will need to store that states. And so we're allowing a model for EKS Anywhere of partially disconnected, so that you will be able to, if you don't have full connectivity to AWS or whatever the case may be, you can actually run Kubernetes still on-prem without needing to like, oh, my internet's down. Your Kubernetes should still work. So we do need to have managed state inside of your data center as well. So that's something that we're figuring out how customers want to use it, what their requirements are, and what their availability is for the data center, because everyone has different, terms of what production means for like, oh, well, my production is these 3 data centers, or my production is this rack in the closet. And so like, it really depends on how someone wants to use it and what their fault tolerances are.
Nice. What about ECS Anywhere? How is that different or the same, or how's that going to work?
Well, I think Massimo had a great blog post. If you have read it already, maybe we can get that link dropped into the chat. But this blog post, it goes into a lot of detail about it. And ECS Anywhere is functioning a little bit different from EKS Anywhere. With EKS Anywhere, we're giving you the distro for the actual control plane to run and operate in your own data center. So you'd be operating the control plane, the etcd that we talked about, as well as your containers, your data plane. With ECS Anywhere, we're going with a slightly different model. We've realized that a lot of ECS customers, the reason why they use ECS is they like to have that fully managed control plane that's hands-off, gets upgraded continuously behind the scenes. They can use the same cluster for years. In some cases, I've had some ECS apps that frankly have been sitting there for 2-3 years, and I haven't had to touch them. So what we said was, can we take that model and apply that to your on-prem? So that way we can give you an ECS agent you can launch inside your data center or your on-prem, whether that's a rack, whether that's just a computer sitting in the closet somewhere, and it'll connect to an ECS control plane in a specific region. You'll be able to use AWS console to connect to that cluster and launch things. And once again, Justin talked about that disconnected state for EKS. Well, same thing here. The way it works is if your ECS agent was to lose connection to the ECS control plane, it would be able to operate in a disconnected state. So your application still runs, even though you wouldn't be able to launch or stop anything on that cluster until you actually reconnected to the AWS region.
Nice.
I love the simplicity of the ECS Anywhere model, where it's like create a tunnel to the region close to you, run the agent, you're good. And it's like everything else is AWS managed service. But the trade-offs there are, like you said, if I'm disconnected in either EKS or ECS Anywhere, I can use kube control because I have the API. I have to run all that stuff. I have to store that states. So I can do things with EKS Anywhere and ECS Anywhere. All the jobs stay. You just have to reconnect basically. But it's a great trade-off for either way. Like if you don't want to run all those bits, ECS Anywhere, it's super simple. Make that tunnel, start the agent, and you're good.
And the other cool thing that I kind of like about ECS Anywhere is that all the monitoring of like container health checks and stuff like that will actually go back over the pipe to the centralized control plane. So I'll be able to have essentially, a lot of people, they would use like Pingdom or another service to hit their website from an external provider, to make sure that their stuff isn't down, because if their data center goes down, maybe that's taken down all of their monitoring and stuff like that. So in this case, you have the highly available AWS control plane that's always there, and then you have your data plane, which may or may not be stable. Maybe you have a power outage or some sort of issue, but you constantly have that highly available ECS control plane that we're managing in the cloud to monitor and detect if your things do go offline. So I think that's a very interesting model for how to have like an external orchestrator that is still monitoring and always there to check to make sure things are going right.
That's awesome.
And I just want to add, so in that blog, Massimo did a really cool demo, and in his demo app that's running, I don't want to give too much away. You should watch the video. It's really cool, but it's running in, Massimo's data center and Raspberry Pi next to his desk, but he's talking to AWS resources using IAM roles. So again, it's not like you're doing anything different when you're running your ECS tasks on-prem. You can attach an IAM role to talk to your resources. You don't have to use hard code keys anywhere. So it's really cool just to have that seamless experience between on-prem and ECS.
It gives you all sorts of cool, this is a random thought. It gives you all sorts of cool, ad hoc IoT options. I mean, that task running on a Raspberry Pi, it's like, oh, lol. But actually, that's kind of cool, right? That could be a Raspberry Pi Zero with an Arduino hanging off of it. And you could have a bunch of hardware sensors. And, I mean, you think about any given building in the city is going to have 500,000 sensors in it or something. It's how cool is that if you could bring that together into a very little piece of, very cheap little piece of commodity compute that then actually runs ECS tasks. That's pretty cool. That's really cool. And it's very seamless. Yeah.
That's awesome.
That's cool.
There's a use case, as I was talking to customers, it's, over the past year, really, two things came up that I was thinking about. One is a couple of customers mentioned, we have our huge investment in data centers. And so moving to the cloud and moving to, a different orchestrator, potentially like ECS, is kind of, they would almost think of it as a step backwards or a sidestep at minimum. In a way, ECS Anywhere will let them continue to leverage that investment that they made, and they can still have the compute available to them in their data centers, but then they get the orchestration from ECS or potentially EKS.
Yeah, it could be EKS anywhere as well. I mean, the thing that Justin was saying is that's all running on top of the EKS distro, which Micah Hausler, the PE that's running that project, has a really great Twitter thread on that. Like basically what the project is, but you can put that on your own Metal or vSphere, right? So if you've got a couple of racks of things and you just bought them and they got another 18 months or something, it's like, sure, use them, use those to roll out your EKS distro images and create some clusters, and you're leveraging that investment that you already have, that you got a ticking clock on still, and you say, I'm not ready to leave this behind yet. You can make use of it. It's really cool.
Yeah, totally. And then the other use case was there was a customer that had a massive database on-prem, and their applications relied on having 1 to 3 millisecond latency to that database to be able to respond. And moving the database was that's going to be a year or two long project. So instead of having to sort of wait on our container migration and cloud migration until the data is fully moved, they can now start to do that work in parallel, and they could start building the plumbing around their container orchestration as if it's in the cloud, even though it's still executing in their data center and has that really low latency to their data. So that's pretty exciting.
That is seriously it just in my head, that is the most, I've heard that use case so many times, Brent. So it's just when you said it, it was like, yes, this is so common because it takes time. Large data stores, it takes time to migrate over. So this is a great way to kind of close the gap there.
In some cases, you can't, it's not data that you just move, right? Come from Disney Animation, all the artists drew and created assets on-prem. They came to a building, they drew on very powerful computers with big GPUs, and those got stored in NFS locally. And it was just, there's, terabytes and terabytes of assets that are being created for every movie. And it's you can't just let's just move that to the cloud real fast. It's okay, wait, they create them every day, all day. And so there's this, trade-off of what can you move, what should you move, and what's right for your business. And so in some cases, it's totally fine to stay hybrid, keep that investment on-prem and do what you need locally. Even in the keynote, Andy had this huge pie chart of where spend is for on-prem databases or on-prem just in general versus cloud. And it was cloud's such a small fraction of all of the infrastructure spend. It's still crazy that, this is 2020. You hear over and over again that cloud is this amazing thing, and it is, but also there is that giant investment that people want to also still use and capitalize on.
Yeah. Well, speaking of investment and giant and all that, we had this announcement that I kind of wonder how many people were surprised by it, but it was AWS Proton. And, Proton is one of those things that I think people were, as I've since talked to customers, I think they're surprised, and then they're I didn't even really know, I knew that I wanted this, but I didn't know that you had it coming. And I always thought this was going to be the work that I was just going to have to do. So I'm really excited to see how that ends up going. And it's in preview right now, but let's talk really quick. What is Proton? How do you guys describe Proton?
So the way I like to describe it is by talking about sort of the stages of a company's growth.
Nice.
So I've come from startups in the background in my past where I started out trying to start my own startup where I was essentially a solo technical founder. And when I was creating architecture, a lot of times I just used the AWS console directly. I would SSH into machines. I do everything sort of Wild West style because it was just me. I don't have anyone else that I'm working with. From there, later, I ended up joining a startup where there's a few people, let's say 6 people were on the dev team. And we reached this point where, okay, now we need to start coordinating with each other. We can't just all be in the console, making direct changes to resources. We need to start using something like infrastructure as code. And that works really well. Like maybe you're have a central Git repo where you put your infrastructure as code templates. Everybody has read-write access. If you do want to modify infrastructure as code template, it goes through a PR process where you change the infrastructure as code, and then it rolls out and changes the infrastructure.
Yeah, and everyone can see those changes in PR form and can keep up with like how this evolves. Yeah, totally.
So that works well for a small startup. But then you start to get to a larger company. Let's say you have 100 devs on your team. Let's say you have 200 developers. You start to reach a point where the different developers are specializing into their own specific application. Maybe you're running, 100 different applications and in a variety of different environments. Suddenly that model of, okay, here's just a central Git repo that everybody has their infrastructure as code in doesn't work as well anymore. You end up with this sort of Wild West where, let's say, Team A was the ones who originally created this template for a particular service, let's say a microservice deployment. And then Team B took that template and they didn't really understand what they were looking at. They made some changes. They accidentally
copy paste. Yes.
Yep. They made some mutated changes to that, and somebody got lazy and just opened up that database security port to the entire world. And now most of your services are secure, but you have this one service out there that just got hacked and all your customer data just got leaked because somebody didn't go off of a central authoritative template. So what ends up happening is a lot of times these companies, they're large, they end up having to build a platform team. And the job of the platform team is to ensure that everybody is using standardized templates that we know are secure. Maybe a lot of times they end up building out their own web portal for actually saying, here's my application, and I want to plug it into our internal platform. And it ends up being a lot.
So just how many of us have built one of those? Like I actually built two bespoke.
It may have been my first Rails app.
Okay. So nice. We're all here in this room, and we're all the ones that we have built those platforms before, and so we started to hear feedback from customers, and they were saying, we don't like the fact we have to build our own platform every time, from scratch, but always, like you said, bespoke platforms. We want a tool that makes it easy for us to actually build that platform, and then we can have a platform team that constructs the templates for how you want an environment or a service to work. And then there's an easy way for them to vend those out to everyone else in the organization. And then here's the most important thing. If you're just using like a copy paste mechanism, you have a centralized repo and everybody's copy and pasting templates from a centralized repo. What happens is you can't track if there are any changes. And if you do a centralized update of that central repo, you can't necessarily force everyone to update. So let's say you had your service deployment and you realize, oh no, there's like a terrible bug in the configuration here. Like, I don't know, ulimit was set wrong, or like a security, a port was not closed when it should be open, or whatever, whatever. You have to go out and potentially to 20, 30, 40 different teams that have adopted this centralized system and say, hey, could you please update to the latest and greatest, system. So one of the things we build in the Proton is the way to say, we can see everybody and every deployment that is based off of this central pattern, and we can go ahead and do a centralized update, and it'll grab at the latest code and push it through the pipeline and deploy out this configuration change to all of these services.
And that's huge for a platform team to have visibility and be able to see that, like, oh, look, these teams are still on 1.3. I can go click, click, click and update them to 1.4. Massive. That is so awesome. And also, because it's just a minor release, I don't even have to tell the team. I'm just going to do it for them. And they don't have to worry about it because they really don't care. They just want their stuff to run, right? So, go ahead.
Yeah, well, so there was a question about, does Proton work with CDK? As that's probably where you're going, Brent.
Yep.
So there is a public roadmap. I'll get that and I'll post it in the chat shortly. Right now, it's only CloudFormation support. However, we do have plans to support Terraform and the CDK as well. So if it's something you want, go to that roadmap +1, because plus ones mean you want it. So we want more. The more plus ones, the better.
Yeah, totally. And it's preview, right? So we at AWS, our model is to get things out there just so that we can start to gather feedback. And so that feedback loop is super critical this early. So instead of, I had someone on Twitter mention, or no, I don't remember where it was, but someone said if it doesn't support Terraform, then the, and I was like, well, I mean, it's preview. So give us a little bit and it will. We've already said that it will. So just hang in there, but also tell us what you think and tell us what's important so that we can help prioritize what's going to be important for you. There's some questions coming in from Twitch also that are kind of interesting.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this question about like, okay, so how do you convince management to adopt Proton or ECS? So in my experience, the best way to go about doing this is to talk about, okay, what are the problems we are facing today that will be solved by this platform? Because there's no point in adopting something if there's not an actual need to do it. Otherwise, it's just a waste of technical effort. And they're going to be like, well, we want you to be building more features, not doing this. So it's best to start from what are the problems. So for example, with containers, a lot of times the problem is we have this environmental drift where developers are developing on their laptops and the code is working, and then we trying to run it in production and it's just full of bugs and we have all these problems, right? So then you start to say, okay, if we had containers as a standard deployment format, we would know for a fact that we had the same artifact developed and locally as running in production. So you're able to say, here's the problem we have. We have an unreliable service because we have all these bugs popping up due to drift between our different machines, runtime versions, and code. We could solve this by having a standardized container. The same thing with Proton. We can say we have this issue where different services have their own bespoke infrastructure and templates, and there's a lot of differences between them, and we don't have a standardized interface for actually deploying a service. Well, Proton is a solution to that. Yeah. So start from the problem and then say, okay, here's the solution to that problem.
Yeah, and then an extension to that is to even maybe describe the problem and how much time does it cost you. As a development team, as an engineering team, you spend how many minutes, hours, days on, for example, doing a deploy? And how many times does your deploy go wrong? So when you're not containerized, I would venture to guess that deploys are hard, lengthy, and problematic. And of course, you can solve all the problems, using any number of methods that don't have anything to do with containers, but containers do help solve a lot of those problems that you'll encounter when doing a deploy. So that's just one example of it takes 5 of us 3 days to do a deploy, and then we're troubleshooting for the other 2, and then we don't want to do it again for another 2 weeks. So we can only do X number of deploys in a year. And if we were on containers, on the other hand, once everything's ironed out, we can do a deploy every 10 seconds if we feel like it. So, describing the problem, like Nathan said, and then the cost of human time, I think is how you convince management.
And this is where you see, the adoption of this methodology that's DevOps, right? And some of us started 10 years ago, and some of us are starting literally today, and everybody's at different places. And, but just something as fundamental as, CI/CD, a lot of people take that for granted. And I know a lot of people that SSH and drop a tarball. That's their deployment. So where are the benefits? And I think that comes full circle to something like Proton is like they'd say, it's like your teams get bigger, you have a platform team, everybody's moving this. It's like, what can we do for you? What have we all done that we know you have to do that we don't ever want to do again? So what can we do for you in that space? And that's, to me, that's what Proton is and it's benefiting both your ops and your developers, or a DevOps team as a whole, where you have assistance, both creating these templates and versioning them and pushing out changes, but also it makes, provisioning, getting a development environment or getting an environment to deploy a service in a lot simpler for your developers. So It's
Yep.
dope. I think one of the things that you said there, it triggers it. No, I'm going.
I love
I'm
DevOps.
No, it's the image. It's the image. Brent, you mentioned it's like the image. We're using this image, and Nate, we talk about it all the time. The container image is the immutable artifact, and everything kind of runs from that, whether we're talking about GitOps or whatever. But we want to talk about images, where we store them, what we do
I
with
just want
them.
to say one other thing really quick.
Yeah,
Yeah.
fine.
And
Sure.
I
Did you
just
see
wanna
how I
add-
did that? That was so good.
This is
All
you
right.
did such a great segue, but me. Look,
Yeah, but let's
you
just
can't
stop and go
have
back.
you can't have an outspoken DevOps person in the room and talk DevOps and not let that person add their 2 cents.
He'll
Okay?
Go ahead,
explode.
Mr. Mustache. Go for it.
I'm sorry, but what I want to say is this. I just want to add that build to your team strengths. So if your team, look, Proton makes a lot of sense for a team that structurally, organizationally has a centralized team that manages infrastructure and kind of controls how everything's built and deployed. You know, there are some teams like Nathan said that you're smaller, you're scrappier, or maybe CDK and owning your own infrastructure and your code base makes a lot of sense. So I just think Conway's Law, it's a real thing. Know your organization and build to your team strengths and use the right tools for the job.
Totally. I loved, by the way, Forrest Brazil had a tweet about Proton, and he just said it's Conway's Law as a service. So yeah, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah, and look, not everybody is going to be like. Look, we all want to be the next, Netflix, or we all want to be super cool and modern. It takes time and it's hard. It's a lot of hard work to get there. So
Yeah.
this is stepping stones. Now let's talk about public ECR images.
Yeah, because that's been a thing for a while, but then all of a sudden it became a bigger thing. So, yeah, let's talk about that.
Who's talking about it?
Yes. Adam, you talk about it. You wrote the blog on it. You should talk about it.
I did not actually. That's false.
Oh, that's true. That's true. You demoed
Martin
it.
Beebe did. Yes, I demoed it. But yeah, so we did just another release was announcing the ECR. First of all, the public gallery, which is a public interface to go and consume and view, Docker
Search
images stored in
for,
ECR.
Find, curate. Yeah, like I immediately went. I think I said this on our show when we talked about ECR public, but I have this big need to find a Ruby container so that I can replace the library Ruby container that I've been pulling from Docker Hub. And so yeah, I mean, like as soon as Gallery launched, I immediately went to the search bar and I typed in Ruby, and sure enough, there was a container for me there that I could start using. So I transitioned over to it right then. It's awesome.
And just, I think one thing I just want to say, sorry, Justin, is just using the ECR public registry. To consume images, you don't need to have an AWS account. This is just open public registry. So that's something I wanted to point out, just to be clear there. But Justin, please go ahead.
Let me put this over in YouTube chat. Hold on a second. There you go. Main differences that I saw between ECR that existed forever for customers, you could make ECR images public. You could make it so that anyone could download them to certain, we had it for certain things like session or not session manager, ECS agent. Like you would pull from ECR internally inside of Amazon. Are you telling me I'm wrong?
Inside of Amazon, you could. You always had to have an IAM identity.
Right.
And
you had to have.
And I said that on the show too, because that was something that bit me, because I thought the exact same way. Oh, if I just open up IAM, make it read only star, then anyone in the world could pull, but they can't. And you had to be in AWS, with an IAM credential of some kind to be able to identify yourself, and then you could pull cross account wherever. But yeah, you couldn't just be like out in someone's data center and pull from ECR.
Which is a big shift here. And a lot of times I know internally on-prem environments, if I wanted something from ECR, I would pull it down locally with ECR credentials on my machine and push it into my registry, and we'd always pull.
And
from
there's
there,
a thing in
basically.
between there, which is what I thought you were talking about, where you can do something like reflection, right? Like you can pull it actually, and then have a service, so like you can fire a Lambda actually that will handle auth for you, and then have a public endpoint for the pull on registry. But like, no, you don't have to do any of that anymore. Like
Right.
that's the point. So under the gallery, which is awesome, there is ECR public, which is public registry endpoint.
Cool things about ECR public is global, globally available endpoint. So it's not, I don't need to know about a region or an account number or anything. It's public.ecr.aws, and then whatever your account namespace is in the container. That's it.
And that gets geo-replicated, like behind the scenes, without you thinking about it or asking for it. It's going to be out there, and it's going to be like available in multiple regions.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So you have Cloudfront, right? So we're caching the layers in Cloudfront, and Cloudfront already has the concept of the cache layer, and then there's a regional edge cache. So you're already taking advantage of Cloudfront's caching abilities. And then on top of that, you have the cross-region replication for your image behind the scenes. So it's highly available. Yeah. And even further, that sits on top of S3, which is already highly available and durable. So
yeah, it's pretty fantastic. And there have been a couple of questions come up on Reddit in the past week asking about, well, how, what are the limits? And that to me is one of the best parts, because this to me sounds super generous. When we started talking about the limits on the show the other day, free tier, there's a free tier. First, if you're hosting an image, then the only thing that you pay for is the space that it takes up. You don't pay for any of the bandwidth or the pulls or anything like that. And in the free tier, you get 50 gigs of space. Like, how incredible is that? And then after that, the pricing is just standard ECR pricing. So, to me, that's super generous. Then you have the client side of things. So that's where another set of limits kicks in for the clients, not for you as the account holder or the image maintainer. And in that situation, you have anonymous pulls, and then you have authenticated pulls, and then you have authenticated pulls inside of AWS. And anonymous pulls, I forget, what's the limit? 5 gigs a month or something like
50,
that? 50.
Right? Or 500. Sorry, isn't it 500 and then 5 terabytes? It's 50. There's 5 and a 0 in there.
Okay, we should have.
Let me look it up.
Yeah, we should have reviewed
500.
500.
Okay, yeah. Let's let
Adam,
in the post that I sent, it's 500 gigs of pull bandwidth.
Okay,
for anonymous. It's 5 terabytes for authorized with IAM credentials outside of AWS networks.
And I think the thing. Okay, so let's stop there for just 1 second, and let's talk about the NAT gateway scenario, because this is something that doesn't jump out at people right away. But let's say that you're, in a giant office behind a NAT gateway, and you're sharing that 500 gigs with, several hundred of your closest friends, doing anonymous pulls. Great. You're going to I don't even know if you'll burn through 500 gigs in a month, right? Even in that scenario, but let's say that you do. If you just switch over to doing authenticated pulls, you just Docker log in and pull using your AWS account. At that point, you switch from 500 gigs to 5 terabytes as your limit, but it's not limited by the IP address anymore. It's 5 terabytes for you personally, just you. Everyone else in the building can also authenticate, and they'll get their own 5 terabyte bucket. So, think about that for a second. That to me sounds just like this super generous limit that you don't have to worry about ever. I can't imagine breaching that in a month. That just is awesome.
The other thing I really appreciate is the fact that the limit is on the dimension that it is, which is on bandwidth. Because I feel what that does is it encourages the creation of smaller images, which in my opinion is probably the right direction to be going. It's not based on pull rate or how many times you pull per hour or anything like that. It's based on actually how many gigabytes, or in this case terabytes, have you actually pulled. And so if you are able to launch like a small Go image that's like under 100 megabytes, that's going to go really, really far. On the other hand, if you're trying to do something like package up a gigantic monolith, and you're looking at like 4 or 5 gigabyte image, you can still do that, but you have a gentle encouragement there to be like, okay, let's reduce the size of that image.
Or an ML data set. Sometimes those are going to be big. But I mean, think about it. Like 5 terabytes just by logging in. And then go ahead.
But if it's in an AWS region, so if you're pulling this in an AWS region, then your cost is literally zero.
Exactly.
Unlimited.
Yeah, that's the third. That's the third one where, like, if you're doing this in AWS and you're authenticating, it all goes away. All the worries go away. So you just unlimited. I mean,
but still build smaller images.
But still build smaller. Yes, you're right.
Like if you have a 750 megabyte Python base layer, just come talk to us. We'll help you.
There are smaller base images out there you can start from.
Wait, what size did you say, Jesse?
And even 750 meg.
Crap.
Yeah. Oh, I've seen it. Brent, come talk to me.
I have a Ruby image that's almost 900.
No.
You gotta do some work on that, Brent.
I know.
Maybe we do that on the show one day. We'll break it down. But we'll all join the show and we'll just all tell you at the same time how to fix it.
It would just be everyone making fun of me. So
hey man, the very first container I built for work was 60 gigs.
Wow.
The container was 60 gigs. We packaged everything in a container and we pushed it internally.
Was that like all the Disney movies?
Yeah. glibc libraries. Yeah.
It was a bunch of tools that we just we don't know. Let's just throw them all in there and see how this container works. And it was 60 gigs. And
I can only imagine how much the network lit up when you actually started trying to deploy that.
There was a lot of data going over that network anyway. It wasn't like the 60 gig was whatever.
Well, speaking of network, so if you're watching us on Twitch, we're going to be dropping off in the next probably 10 minutes or so because there's another show coming up. But if you're watching us on YouTube, we're going to keep going. So if you're watching us on Twitch and you want to keep going with us, then switch over to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/containersfromthecouch, or Justin just posted the direct link in the Twitch chat. So if you're on YouTube, hang out with us, stay there. It's all good. We're going to keep going because we have a lot more to talk about, but it's going to go past the hour for sure. So we want to make sure that if you want to hang with us, then you're welcome to. What are we going to talk about next?
Well, I wanted to point out one other thing. One quick thing with ECR. I really liked a couple improvements that were made in Gallery specifically, where there are some tabs specifically on how to use it, some information about it. Every time I go to Docker Hub, it's kind of like, well, it's probably just a copy paste README from a Git repo. And it didn't always have use this command or do this. And so I love that we were able to break that down in usage requirements, some information about it. And I'm just gonna say, my favorite feature about it is actually the copy button only copies the image string and not the Docker pull command. Because every time from Docker Hub, if I click that button to copy it, I always had to erase Docker pull, and it drove me crazy. Paste it into a Docker file or on command line. And so the copy here is just the URL for that image, typically the latest or whatever the defaults tag is.
Yeah.
And I totally just shared my screen and blocked Brent's face. Sorry.
Oh.
Brent has become a container.
It's all
this
good.
is when you reach the top. You become one with the container. So I just wanted to show the gallery while we're here and talk to what Justin was saying. So first of all, in the search, you can drill down based off of different parameters, right? Based off of operating system, architecture, and then just to show what Justin was talking about there is if you copy that image, it's not copying the whole Docker pull command, just the URL. So I just wanted to show.
Yeah.
Honestly, that will just save me so much time because I do that all the time, and I'm always like, okay, let me delete the Docker pull part, or change pull to run or something. So.
Yep. Oh, you're so right, and I never even really thought about that. But yeah, that has been a little minor annoyance for me for a while. All right. What else? What should we talk about next? There's still a ton of stuff that we announced.
So I was just gonna say one thing quick, because you said we have a little more space.
Yeah.
And Adam brought up S3, and I just wanted to point out that like my noodle was baked thinking about S3 just kind of quietly
Strong
and very respectfully becoming strongly consistent read after write. Like what?
I mean,
not.
It's amazing.
that's a strong move. Like
It's pretty rad.
like
It's pretty rad, and I think
our
it
oldest
solves so
server.
many problems. And also, I just don't even understand how they did it really. So it's
Yeah.
really rad.
Yeah, that was
Agreed.
fantastic to hear. Oh, and as for other service teams, you know, the Lambda team, the serverless team announced container packaging support. So what's up with that? Let's talk about that for a minute.
I can take that one.
Yeah,
I
Sure.
love talking about this one.
I know
Look,
you
so I'm gonna go really quick and simple on it. This is about a better, improved workflow for people that are used to container workflows coming to Lambda development, right? Everybody doing Lambda development is just fine with how it works. The thing rocks. Everybody's fine with zip files. Everybody loves SAM. It's cool. This is about I'm a container developer. I know Docker. I know containers. This is how I do my thing, and I'm showing up going zip files. What? This is a door into Lambda that's just really easy. Plus, maybe there are things with zip files that you don't love, or maybe you want to think about managing dependencies a little differently, or maybe you just want to use Docker because you have a T-shirt and you're like, what's that all about? That's cool too. But it's about being able to package your function, which is going to work exactly the same way. Your applications are architected exactly the same way. Still an event-driven architecture, still running entirely serverless in Lambda. Those functions are just going to be able to be packaged as container images, which are OCI compliant. So Docker images, but also any images you build with any OCI compliant image format. So it's super cool. It's a really thinking like developer first move.
Yep.
It's focusing on the customer and saying, how can we make this smoother for some people? That's what this is. It's super cool.
I was also thinking about it from the perspective of like the back end, and I don't know, I don't have any insight into how that service is built or anything like that. But if you think about what they had or still have, I should say, zip files. Every time there's a new zip file, you have to unzip the whole thing to be able to execute it. And now with a container image, you know, we all know that 99% of the container image is probably the same and in cache already because it's the earlier layers and you've only made like one tiny change to probably the last layer. And so, you know, untarring it in the case of a container is going to be super trivial because all the other layers are already still sitting there in cache already.
Right. If you haven't adopted the Lambda layers already, then this is a way to get that kind of benefits. Yeah. Good point.
Yeah, and so speaking of layers, one of the important things is that the layers are actually available. Like if you go to that gallery.ecr public ECR gallery, you can find the Lambda layers there. And so what this really solves is it solves one of these problems. I remember early on in the discussions about this feature with Lambda PMs, one of the things I've raised was, okay, well, how do I actually run a Lambda locally if I'm developing and I want to try to execute this Lambda locally? How do I solve that problem? And I pointed out that there were some third-party Docker images that people had made from the community to provide essentially the Lambda environment and run a Lambda function locally. Well, now there's an official Lambda base image, and you can run that exact same Lambda base image locally on your machine and know that that's the same thing that's going to be used out there on the real Lambda service. And you could also, interestingly, if you wanted to, you could have run that same Lambda base image in an ECS cluster or Fargate if you really wanted to. Like it's just a standard image that runs anywhere.
Nice.
Right. There has been some chatter on that, like, oh look, I can take this Lambda container image now and run it on like, you know, a Kubernetes cluster. Yes, you can. There's not really a lot of reason to do that though. So I just want to throw that out there because it's sort of like a joke. I think. Like I don't really see there's a lot of reason to run it like in a cluster, but running it locally, that can be kind of huge. And I can see a lot of innovation happening there where, you know, pulling things together. And if you look, there's other open source projects in this space, like the FM project or OpenWhisk or OpenFast that allow you to do those things because they're container built. So you can just run it like on your laptop. So now you can actually do that with Lambda too. I think it's going to open some doors for some local tooling and some local development flows that are pretty cool.
Cool.
For clarification on that too, because this is Lambda specific, like you can't take any container and now run it in Lambda. I know there was confusion around that.
Yeah,
Good
flip
mention.
around that is it doesn't go the other way, right? So this is about basically
Container
it's about that
packaging.
developer. Yeah, it's about the developer workflow and the packaging for your functions. It's not that Lambda can run any old container, right?
Right.
Because it can't. And why would you want to, right? Lambda is about serverless architecture. It's about leveraging that stuff. It's not about taking your monolithic Ruby app that's in a gigabyte sized container like Brent's and running it, it's still Lambda, right? It's still serverless. So it's
Brent
that's a
just
good model.
knows. Brent knows he lives in Texas. His containers have to be bigger.
That's right. Everything's bigger.
Everything's bigger in Texas.
Nice.
Is this being kind of nitpicky here? But you can run, like, if you have an Alpine image, you can of course create your own container image. You just have to have the Lambda runtimes. Like, you have to package it to fit into Lambda. It's not just like, I just wanted to clarify
you can
that.
make your own custom. Yeah, you can make your own custom. You basically have to have the runtime layer and also the entry points have to be set up the right way.
Yeah. That's fair. That's a good point. All right. So as I said earlier, we're going to drop off of Twitch because there's another show coming up, but we're going to continue on YouTube. And so you can find us at youtube.com/containersfromthecouch and just meet us there. And we're already there. So feel free to switch over just anytime. Justin posted the link into the chat as well. Oh, yeah. Okay.
This internet TV stuff is pretty magical.
But coming up, we're going to talk about we want to talk about Skylens or the new ECS console, as we should refer to it publicly. Sorry, EKS add-ons, and let's see. I don't know, Firelens. There's
other stuff.
There's
totally
stuff.
other stuff. We could just keep going.
Yep, we're going to keep going. So see everyone on YouTube, and I'm going to turn off Twitch, I think.
Yeah, I don't know if we have to end and go back.
Twitch is
we can't
shutting
do
down.
that. So let's see. How do we do that? I should have probably tested this first.
Did you?
I think we need is that. I think we need that sound from Star Wars. That.
Oh, is that all? That's all it takes.
Did that do it? I think that did it, right? Oh my God! I shut off Nathan.
Oh, you shut up.
Come on, guys. I just need to get my charger.
Oh, that's hilarious. So I think I did it. I think are we still on YouTube? I didn't do that, did I?
I'm not
looks like
playing
we're
it
still there.
I'm on the page, but I don't have it playing because the echo. So
Yeah.
I actually
If
had
you're
Twitch
watching
and
us,
YouTube and this open, and I had 3
Yeah,
Here We
something.
Goes.
3 Here We Goes is even better than 1 Here We Go. Let's just say that because we're definitely going to get going if we have 3 of them.
We are live streaming on YouTube still. I've confirmed it.
Nice.
Perfect.
That is so great because I totally did not actually know how to do that before I said we were going to do it. So
that was a
did
hot
great.
reload right there. We did it live.
exactly. Yes, doing it live. Where's
So-
Misha?
I just have to say, we're going to transition into these EKS announcements. And Jesse, I have to say, these 2 announcements, I'm crazy about them because one thing, lowering that barrier of entry to Kubernetes, I think we're just continuously making it easier and easier to run Kubernetes and to run it in a way where it's really the management is more so on AWS. And also the visibility is greater for me, the customer. So I don't know what you want to start talking about, but I'm really excited to talk about these.
Man, I'm excited to talk about these too. I've been working with the team on both of these features, and I have a session next week. So this is another one of those that I think it's been mentioned somewhere. We did announce both of these features, but I don't think there's any sessions yet. So I think I have one session for both of these features because I see them as sort of working together, which I think you do too, Adam. And that is, I think, Tuesday. So yeah, basically it's like you said that, EKS first shipped, a couple and a half years ago. And it was all about, security, reliability, and availability. Those are the core, and those are still the core tenets for everything that we do there. But initially it was just about removing that undifferentiated heavy lifting, like we talk about with the control plane. So building and managing your cluster life cycles, right? How do I get this thing up? We've all seen Kelsey's Kubernetes the hard way. It's how we learned. Most of us learned how to do this, and then we went, don't want to do that anymore.
Yep.
So you take your bash
That
scripts
was
and your
hard.
duct tape, right? You take your bash scripts and your duct tape, and you come to a managed service. And so that was the first thing. The evolution of that moved into the data plane, right? So we talk about the control plane, and that's where like your API server is, where etcd lives, where like basically all of the guts of making the cluster work. That's the control plane. Your data plane is where your compute is. So it's where your nodes are. It's so we have managed node groups. So you can provision and you can manage the lifecycle of your nodes, your worker nodes. But also we have Fargate integration, right? So both of those managing the lifecycle of your data plane. And now with add-ons, the next step is sort of that managing the lifecycle, the provisioning and the lifecycle of your operational cluster software. So your VPC CNI plugins, your Core DNS, your Kube proxy, and also maybe controllers, right? App mesh controller, the load balancer controller. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about operational software. And so add-ons gives you a curated list of, or curated set of these types of software that are built and tested together to run on EKS, and a management interface in EKS through the console, through the CLI, through EKS Cuddle, through basically how all the ways you work with EKS to add these add-ons to your cluster, either at cluster creation time. So you can basically just be like, click, give me VPC CNI. I'll take that when you create my cluster, thank you. Or later, you can enable cluster add-ons. And then also once they're there, we have single operation updates. So this is a pretty cool part of this that like, it's just sort of, it's almost like you take it for granted because yeah, sure, when your control plane is down rev, what do? Click upgrade now.
Yeah.
When you have a managed node group that goes off, oh, you make an API call, use the CLI, click update now, whatever, right? That's where we're going with this. Where you have VPC CNI and 165 and 17 comes along and you say, okay, update now. And under the covers, EKS will go ahead and do a rolling, swap in deployment. So if it might be a deployment, it's going to be a daemon set, whatever it is, you're going to do the right strategy for high availability. So under the covers, we're going to move those pieces of software for you on a node by node, instance by instance kind of way, so that you don't have any downtime. So you kind of just.
So those times when I had to update Core DNS, either before or after doing an update of my cluster, like that can now potentially, or probably will be, just taken care of for me.
Yeah, well, so it's going to be just the same way it is with the control plane and the data plane upgrades. They are opt-in. So we'll tell you, hey, there's a new version of this. Would you like to upgrade? And then you can, or update. And so you can just, click the button, make the CLI call. And under the covers we'll do that. And how that works, right? Because if we stop and think about this, it's like, oh, that's cool. What about configuration changes? Right? Like if I've got YAML in my repo and I do a kubectl apply, and I've got my changes there, and I make a couple changes, or I change a version, but I have other configuration customization, and I say apply, kubectl takes care of me. The tooling takes care of me. How does this work under the covers if we're just swapping the software out? And this is the really cool thing about add-ons is under the covers, we're using this new feature called server-side apply, which is in Kubernetes 1.18 and newer. Server-side apply migrates kubectl apply to the server. It implements a better conflict resolution algorithm, and it implements change tracking over all the different fields that you might have changes on. So if you think about that, you say, okay, we're going to push it all up on the server. It's Kubernetes problem now. And they've done work upstream to actually make this a much more robust, much more really kind of error-proof conflict resolution thing. So it's almost like using Git now, right? Where it's like, okay, well, we can do conflict resolution. You can do what, or maybe you're going to get involved and say, well, I've got some really hairy configuration changes that I want to make, and I'm going to make sure that I'm going to go through my diffs, right? You can do either one of those. So because we use that feature, that means that add-ons does have a minimum requirement of Kubernetes 1.18 and EKS.3. But from there, it should just work seamlessly. And we're going to be able to roll out more types of software, like I said. So for example, like the app mesh controller, the Flux operator for GitOps, Prometheus, CloudWatch, like anything that you might be using, it's like, take a look there. And
for
The
me,
roadmap.
like manage add-ons is such a good operator tool because it helps
Yeah.
me. There's so many moving pieces in like Kubernetes is the API server, but then you do need core DNS and you want a metric server and you want Prometheus.
You need
and
all
you
the
want
other
something else.
stuff.
And all of those
Absolutely.
things aren't required, but they kind of are in a lot of production situations. And so in this case, like I have had problems with like, hey, when I had a repo full of YAML files and I was just deploying that and saying, well, like the new version of core DNS came out, like just bump that version, apply it. But then I find out that like my Kubernetes version didn't support that version of core DNS, or my config map. I've seen outages of my config map for core DNS was wrong. And so like the new version of core DNS didn't accept a field. So then the pod didn't start. And then nothing inside Kubernetes can do service discovery. And so adding this as a managed service inside of Kubernetes allows us to keep parity for not only what's the latest version, but also, hey, you're in Kubernetes 1.18, you don't want metric server 2.0 or whatever it is. Like we can make sure that those match correctly so that you are on the latest version for your cluster. And you're not going to run into problems of like, hey, that endpoint doesn't exist in this, service or this version of Kubernetes. And so, or that config, needs to change or whatever the case may be, we can totally make that easier for the operators of the clusters and say, okay, now let's make sure that everything matches here. Just like if I'm doing, like local development with, like Python or something, right? Like I have a Python library that, Python 3 isn't supported on this one. Okay, now what do I do? And like, do I upgrade everything? Do I keep it at the old version? We're doing that at a cluster level with Kubernetes and managed add-ons. And I think it's a great, a great service for anyone operating clusters, especially high available and at scale.
That's such a great application of server-side apply. I remember when I first read about server-side apply, I was thinking there must be some really interesting things you could do as a cluster operator with this. And now seeing this in action, I'm like, I'm so glad that was added in 1.18.
Yeah, me too. I mean, it's like, that was when I first read about that feature, and then I had actually read about server-side apply later, and I was like, I wonder what. Right, I bet there. And yeah, sure enough, that's like, we're going to use that, of course. Yeah, good idea, Jesse. Yeah, but it's really cool. They had already thought of that. They didn't need my help on that.
Right,
but
and
super
also
cool.
conflicts, right? Like two people deploying at the same time over each other. Server-side apply helps with that three-way merge.
Absolutely.
The other thing that you pointed out with managed fields, the coolest thing I saw was the kube control blame plugin. Which allows you to literally track like the diff of like what happened here. I'll throw it in chat, but it's just like git blame. Yeah, git blame line by line in my config. Who changed this line? And you can see which controller did it or which person did or wherever it came from. And that managed fields in server-side apply helps with that, which is awesome.
So there's a question: can you call the add-on upgrade also via the API, and to use Terraform and have it be version controlled?
Yep.
That was easy.
You can. Well, so we tend to do that, right? And as we all know, sometimes we put a new service out, and we put things out as fast as we can, a new feature rather. Sometimes it goes out like without CloudFormation support, and we're getting better at that, and we have new systems in place to help with that because we know that can be frustrating. But pretty much the API happens first. And so then the question is whether or not is it a public API or not, and these are. So effectively anything that you see in the AWS CLI is going to be an endpoint that you can call programmatically through the API. And so yes, there's a handful. So there's APIs to for a given cluster to show the add-ons that are available and to describe them and see the different versions. And then you can of course enable them, disable them, upgrade them.
Yeah. And is this already built in, at least release candidate wise? Is this already available or built into EKS control as well? So like when you want to provision,
it's in an RC. Yep.
Include these add-ons.
Yeah. So what's really cool, that I'm glad you brought that up. So the one thing I wanted to say is like, not only is the conflict resolution stuff cool and that these are built and managed together and all that, the one other thing is that, sometimes when you're running the software, you're just running it on a node and the node is using the node role. It's inheriting that, it's a process running on the node, right? So with add-ons, you're actually running these at a pod level. And we're like basically allowing a really easy way to attach a particular service role account, service role to the piece of to the add-on, right? So for example, VPC CNI can have just those actions required for that on a service role, attach it, and that's it. So least priv like in the stack, in your operational software,
Or the
which
load
is really
balancing
dope.
controller
So
potentially.
EK,
When that-
yeah, LBC, yep, app mesh controller. Basically, any of these will have like this is the role we should be using. What's neat with EKS Cuddle is if you just say, oh yeah, go ahead and build that for me with OIDC true, right? And don't give it a profile, it'll create one for you that's appropriate for that add-on, which is
That's
really
dope.
neat.
that's
It's
very cool.
That's very much like those EKS Cuddle people to be thinking about the user and say, how can we make this easier? So they did a great job on this. They jumped on it, and sort of as we typically see, we're working on it and they're working on it at the same time. And so I think it isn't an RC, but that's just how they release, right? Where they announce something as an RC and a week later it goes into the version. So
Well,
it is
you know
new.
what else would be cool with all of this is if you could see it all in a console somewhere.
Nice
Like-
segue, dude. That's
Oh,
good.
man, that was so good, Brent. That was so good.
All right.
Get an
Well, so that's
A+
the
for
other
that one.
feature. That's the other feature that Adam wanted. And like, I brought a browser up just because I think
Oh,
it's
yeah.
the easiest. It's the easiest thing, just to show you. So the other thing that we're announcing, the big kind of ECAS feature right now, is the new console. So we have a brand new console, and we've sort of going along those lines of sort of making things more accessible, easier to use, making it simpler. To Adam's point, we're opening views through the console into your Kubernetes clusters. So right now you log into the console and it's very much a sort of administrative status checking thing, right? You can add your compute, you can create clusters, you can delete them, you can look at your logging configuration, but we're actually adding now into that, being able to look into the cluster and see the objects. So if we go into a cluster here, so the first thing you see is the overview, and I'm going to just skip because I have a bunch of Fargate running. So with, here's a managed node group. So actually, let me make that a little bigger. That's probably a little better, huh?
That's good. Thank you.
Yeah, right there. Yeah. So this is the overview. So you're going to see your nodes, right? And so you're going to see the instance type, if there's a managed node group in play, how old they are, what their status is. And clicking into this, you actually get a really good visualization of the Kubernetes node. Now, this is not the EC2 instance in this case. This is the Kubernetes node. This is the object in your cluster. So you see like the info about it, like what the kernel version is, what the runtime is. You can see your resource allocation and your capacities. This is great for troubleshooting really quick. These are your conditions. Am I having memory pressure? Do I have PID pressure? Am I running on a headroom, right? It's all right here. Labels and annotation, super cool. But then this right here is actually a link to the EC2 instance that is backing that node. So if you do have issues, you can just like jump right over here, look at this. So this I like to think of as like your cloud resources in context with your Kubernetes objects. So it's pretty cool. So kind of jumping into the other side of this is like, well, what about my applications? And so this is a visualization of all the workloads that are happening in all namespaces. And you can, of course, drag this down to just a particular namespace. So we can say, there's the deployments in this namespace. You can jump over here and see there's a deployment here in this namespace, and we jump in and actually see the deployment information, and we see all the pods.
Very nice.
And so then you can kind of keep clicking and say, okay, well, I got everything I need here, but what are these pods doing? Like maybe a pod is not in a running status or not in an expected status. You click in and you actually see the info about that pod and the containers, and you can click down and say, okay, well, here's my environment variables. Here are my mounts. Here are my ports. Basically all of this stuff is right here. And you can kind of click around too and say, okay, well, this pod's actually controlled by a replica set. Let's go look at that. Right? I mean, you can actually get around what is effectively a super flat API in Kubernetes land. We try to roll up these views that show you, useful stuff.
There's a lot of similarities to the Kubernetes dashboard.
There is, and yeah. So go ahead, Justin.
That's what I was going to point out. I mean, a lot of people that have been using Kubernetes for a while, they have the Kubernetes dashboard, or there's like Lens, or there's a lot of new Kubernetes visualization tools, which are amazing. I remember, what was the Weave Scope back in the day?
Yeah.
Like that was just amazing to see the connections, and all that stuff was awesome. This was, fully managed service with your whatever IAM credentials you're bringing to the table. You can allow people to see certain pieces of it, which is also helpful because there's so much investment in, if you have console access, you have some restrictions probably in larger organizations. If you're a smaller shop or independent, like you probably run your own, like I run Lens locally. Like, why do I need a centralized console? Like at larger scale and with more people, it makes a lot of sense to have something centralized that can be managed this way. And this is early for us as a launch. Like we have so many other things we want to put in this. And I wanted to point out, like, add-ons and manage the dashboard, like those weren't even in the keynote. Like those weren't like
True,
Andy didn't even mention, like there's so
There's
many things
so
that were,
much stuff going on.
Yeah. I mean,
I don't even think ECR Public was in the keynote. Like, there's just so much. It's amazing.
Yeah, like squeezing everything in that one session for all of AWS was crazy. But there's been so many other announcements that have still happened around everything that's there. So if you missed add-ons or the dashboard, like, it's fine. You didn't miss them in the keynote somewhere. Like, we still launched a lot of things without Andy actually saying the words. It turns out, like, our launch process isn't Andy has to say it.
Right, we can do it without him even saying it, or those shoes. Yeah,
But it sure is nice when he does say it.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
So I don't want to take too much more time on this, but I do want to call out one thing quick, if I can, before we move on to something else.
Oh yeah.
Other than, like we were talking about before, if you're using Fargate, you can see your nodes. Like, each Fargate pod shows up as a node, and that seems a little weird at first. But if you think about how Fargate works, this makes total sense, and it's working as designed. Right, a Fargate pod gets its own execution environment, its own VT context that actually is joined to the cluster as a node, so you can see the node, which is pretty cool. The one thing I wanted to point out
Go back, Jesse. You buried that lead right there. What's the container runtime?
Oh. I'll come back to that. Actually. I'll come back to that. That's a really good one. I'm sorry. I just want to call out one thing. So this is the new console is the console. So it's not optional. You don't have to click anything to sign up for it. You don't have to turn it on, but it does do a new thing. And it's a kind of a new thing for other services, right? Where we have the console experience is governed by your IAM permissions, the policies and the roles that you have in place that give you a certain ability to do certain actions, right? So we also have a Kubernetes cluster in play, and that is its own thing, right? The RBAC is happening there, and we have a really cool integration where you can take your IAM credentials and bind them into an RBAC binding in the cluster, and people do that, and that's how we use kubectl now, right? The one thing I want to call out here is if you create your cluster or you're using different credentials with kubectl on your cluster, then you use in your console, and I mean IAM principles, so either your role or your user, you will see this kind of thing. Now, we're working on a little bit of a better error message because this is a lot more people than we expected. So we're going to make this a little more useful, and maybe not red X, maybe like a blue eye. But I want to call out that that's all this is. Your cluster is not broken, right? You can still get to all the stuff that you already see, that you already know about, right? But you can't get to workloads and you can't get to the nodes until you actually get whatever credentials you're using in the console into your cluster auth map. And the documentation is going to go through all that. And I just wanted to call that out. Thank you for giving me 45 more seconds. So we did have a thing that I wanted to show Justin. So we were talking about container runtimes, and there's a little bit of news that we want to talk about that's been on the Twitter buzz feeds.
Oh man, it kind of blew up.
I just want to show you, like, when you're using Fargate, you have a node, and look at the container runtime of that node is containerd. Yep. So when you're using Fargate, you're already using containerd as your runtime.
You're in the future.
People have survived this whole time that way. Like, that's amazing.
All right, we can unshare my screen, and now we can talk. We can talk stuff.
Well, to give a little background on that for anyone that might be on the stream that doesn't know, Docker or Kubernetes has announced in 1.20, which is the next release of Kubernetes, which I think is next week is when it's coming out, is going to deprecate Docker as a runtime for the worker nodes. What that actually means is they're going to print a line in the log that says, don't use Docker in the future.
Right.
That's all it is for 120. In 124 is the plan, which should be around this time next year. They actually want to remove the pieces that actually run Docker, like the Docker CLI, as like, I'm going to run my container. Containerd has been there for a very long time, and there's a lot of work that has happened that makes the actual migration of a cluster to say use a different runtime seamless. You most likely will not even know the difference if you're in Fargate. Like, you probably didn't even know you're running Containerd already without Docker. So there's a lot of pieces there. I'll paste in here also the blog post we wrote for the Kubernetes blog, which goes into some details about like what the change actually means. There are a couple things, like if you run Docker builds inside of Kubernetes, Docker and Docker won't work because the Docker socket's not there. You can install Docker and have the Docker socket there, but Docker's not going to be executing your Kubernetes pod. So there's a lot of things. I'm planning another blog post specifically for EKS, but just want to address that for anyone that was like, oh no, like Docker's gone. Yes, it's going away, but it was planned from years ago. So it's okay.
Yes. And your containers will continue to run. So
Yeah, you can test out a world where Docker is already gone just by launching a Fargate EKS pod. Yeah. And you'll be on Containerd already and be able to test it out.
Yep.
Yeah.
And like Justin said, like a really good thing to note is that like when you're running the Docker engine, the whole shebang, it's already running Containerd. You know, I think Michael Crosby started that project like, I don't know, was it 4 or 5 years ago? I mean, he saw to the future and went, we're going to run in Kubernetes. We're going to run in other places. We need a better way to scale all these processes and supervise them. And so it's already there. So all your Docker images will still work. Any images you build with Docker and push to ECR, push to other registries are still going to work. And that's a really important part because, you know, we take for granted. I mean, right, with the 5 of us here, we got like 100 years experience in this space, right? We take for granted that
old.
I'm calling you old, no, I'm old. We're all old, you guys. Like that's my point. Is that there's people who are building their first container image like later tonight, right? I mean, we got to remember that. And so it's like, oh, Docker's gone. Docker. Why am I running Docker on my laptop? These are all different pieces. There's a lot of moving parts. And yeah, like Justin said, there's a really good blog there, I think, and a good tech note around Docker Shim that's really worth reading. And then watch for his technical missive that will come soon.
Yeah, if you're in a big enterprise and you've already have a lot of workloads in Kubernetes, definitely plan and say, hey, are we using Docker commands in scripts or Docker and Docker for builds or provisioning machines with Docker? Like those things you'll need to change, and you should start planning that migration now to discover those pieces and replace them. There are command line tool equivalents for Containerd for a lot of things, whether that's building images or running images, whatever it is. There's I forget what the actual, it's CRITL or something like that. I don't remember.
Cry control.
Cry control, that's it.
Crack huddle.
So there are options, but look into it, and we'll have some. And definitely with EKS, we're going to have a lot of information over the next year for if you're migrating to newer versions of EKS that don't have Docker runtime, what that means to you. So don't worry about it from a managed standpoint, but just something to think about.
Probably also worth mentioning if you happen to be using BottleRocket OS as your EKS node group AMI, that's also purely Containerd already.
Containerd.
So
except for the ECS.
And your
ECS versions have.
Did I say EKS runtime?
No, you're right. You said okay. BottleRocket for EKS. Yes, there's different variants of BottleRocket.
Yeah. Is BottleRocket for ECS out?
It's in a preview.
Oh, awesome!
It came out in preview in August.
Yeah,
when I did the show on it, was the announcement.
It's been a long year.
It hasn't. I knew that, but I didn't know. I thought there had been some other like next step that I missed, and I guess there wasn't.
No, the preview is there. So,
2 things. One, by the way, that checklist, Justin, would be great to put in your blog. Like that would be something really cool to have. Like even if it's not in that blog, just another blog or somewhere. But there was a question before we move on from the EKS console. Jesse, did you want to take this question? Are there any plans to also integrate to like restart deployments or actually like
in the console?
Yeah, from the console.
So right now, obviously, we're focused on visualization and status checking and just kind of being able to help you triage and we've just started with workloads. So I should have mentioned that we're adding new types of objects as we roll more features out. So we'll be adding things like services and ingress and endpoints, and we're going to look at volumes, obviously, and persistent volume claims, and sort of that. And that gives you that, again, that in context, you can go from a PVC to a PV, and in the PV, you'll see a link to your, say, for example, EVS volume, right? So we're looking at more of that. I'd be interested in hearing interest in, action console, right? Like being able to, because we're looking at how do we surface more information, like logs, or can we actually click through? Can we determine where the logs from this pod are actually being published? If that's like CloudWatch or Cloud Insights, can we have just a little clickety click, right? So those are the types of things that we're thinking about even before we get to like, oh, by the way, right click this and delete this deployment, or let's take this replica set and scale it up to 12 from 10. So we're interested in hearing about those use cases. Right now, the focus is, information triage, visualization. But yeah, come to the roadmap, and
shoot Jeff
give us
a note on Twitter.
Let me put in a feature request right now. I want to be able to see the YAML as well, right there on the console, and
that's true.
And
that seems like
maybe
a cool
download
idea,
the YAML back out.
I want to be able to cycle and rotate all the nodes.
Okay, this is becoming a feature request show now.
I'm
Jesse,
here for it.
Is the container, is this on the regular container roadmap, or is there a specific one for the console?
That's on, I believe that's the regular container roadmap.
Okay.
And internally we track things differently, but out externally for open source, it's all right there. And not only just, that one. Yep. Did it go?
I put it in chat.
Did you put it in chat? Okay, cool.
So, by the way, we are going to next week on the show. Jesse's going to come back. We're going to talk about add-ons and the new console. We'll do some deep dives, right, Jesse? Or did
I thought I wouldn't have talked for like 15 minutes then. Otherwise, I'm sorry, you guys. Yeah, I'll come back and talk about this.
That's great. Jesse didn't even know he was on the show, but hey, you're on the show next week. So
hey.
And I'm on Monday for EKS Distro.
Yep.
So I'll be showing that off too.
Oh, sweet. Cool.
Yeah. So let's transition. I think we have a few more things to talk about, and we appreciate everyone sticking around listening to us jabber on here. Justin, why don't you talk a little bit about Carpenter and go into that a little bit?
Yeah, there were two open source projects I wanted just to mention as they had recent milestones or releases. Carpenter is the first one, which we announced 2 weeks ago, I think, with a blog post. Yeah, that's right. It was Container Day before KubeCon. So it's a autoscaler for Kubernetes clusters that's slightly different than the current autoscaler, how it works. So the current autoscaler will look for pods that can't schedule, and then if one can't schedule because of resource limits, creates a new node. That's what it does. It's a very reactionary sort of situation. Carpenter, it looks at metrics, and it says, okay, what metrics do I want to scale my cluster on? And that could be, standard CPU and memory utilization of, hey, if the whole cluster reaches 70% utilization, just add another node until I bump it down to 65 or something. Like you can have any sort of metrics in Carpenter's cool because it's pluggable. And so there's examples in there to say, hey, let's scale the cluster based on an SQSQ. If I'm scheduling jobs that need to run in my Kubernetes cluster, and currently that queue is 10 jobs deep, fine, keep the cluster the same size. But if that job, if that queue goes to 100, hey, let's actually spin up some more nodes so we can get through this queue faster. And so Carpenter allows those pluggable.
Which all of a sudden this week, I've heard from so many people who that is like exactly what they're looking for, is to be able to scale based on a queue. And I was like, wow, great, here it is.
Yep.
So
and so
awesome.
Carpenter right now for where it's scaling is AWS specific, but we want this to be a generic autoscaler for any Kubernetes cluster in, whether that's on-prem or wherever you're running Kubernetes, to be able to say, okay, let's scale it and pull in metrics from whatever. So it's all pluggable and saying, I can, you can have metric server that's standard Kubernetes components, probably could be deployed with add-ons. We could have that as a way to push metrics into Carpenter, and Carpenter could scale on that, but you could tie it to anything else. If I could say, hey, it's, Carpenter metrics of like, what day of week is it? Like Saturday, scale me down. Sunday, like Sunday night's coming back up. You can make whatever metrics you want and have rules based on those metrics to scale the cluster up and down. So it's a really cool thing. The work's just getting started, but if you're interested in alternative auto scaling options, definitely check it out.
Nice.
Did you want to talk about Cdks too?
Yeah, Cdks just recently hit 1.0. And so I just want to call that out as if you haven't played with it, it's a different way to write your Kubernetes manifest instead of using YAML files, or even a lot of people do, Helm templates or JSONet or whatever it is. This is along the same lines as the AWS CDK, where you're writing TypeScript or Python or a standard programming language, and then that boils down into the Kubernetes spec of what you need. And Nate has a ton of great experience writing CDK for ECS and add-ons there as well. So definitely, reach out if you want to understand the CDK, but also Cdks as the Kubernetes specific one just got accepted into the CNCF as a sandbox project. So it's moved from the under AWS control or AWS open source to actually CNCF sandbox projects. So we're expecting to get a lot more contributions from other people, and as interest grows, being able to grow that as just a standard. This is open source. This is how open source should work. As far as anyone can contribute, there's not one company behind the wheel saying like, no, we're not going to do that because this is our way or something. Like, we want this to be very generic. It applies to any Kubernetes cluster, and you can use it for your kind cluster on your local machine or your EKS cluster in the cloud.
And I'm particularly excited about Cdks Plus, which is sort of the next level above Cdks.
The streaming service. Yeah, that's awesome.
I see where you come from.
Justin
Mandalorian season 3 on Cdks Plus.
Well, so what I was going to say is Cdks Plus basically allows you to build like these higher level patterns on top. So if it allows you to build a reusable pattern similar to what we were talking about earlier with AWS Proton. So it allows you to create your own abstraction for what does my service deployment look like, or what does it mean to have a method that says, like, for example, I want to add this add-on to my cluster. You can build a lot of those things we release as managed services yourself, actually using Cdks Plus if you want a little bit more of that direct control. You have a framework now for controlling the deploy of all these lower level Kubernetes resources with one higher level packaged up resource, basically.
And yeah, I mean,
imagine when these things converge, because like you'll be able to have Proton where you let your dev team or you on behalf of your dev team provision a cluster for them, and it kicks off a Cdks Plus, set of logic that goes out and builds your cluster the way you want, and adds in all the add-ons that are necessary for your enterprise environment, and gets everything configured exactly the way it needs to be. And then the dev can, check the next box, and all of a sudden all of their stuff gets deployed out onto that environment.
There's a lot of possibility here.
That is so cool.
So I remember something I realized we forgot to talk about earlier, and that was the AWS batch on Fargate.
Oh,
yes.
Yeah.
Totally forgot to mention that earlier.
Interesting. Yes, I forgot.
So this was a very popular feature request. If you're not familiar with AWS batch, it's a tool that's really designed for high performance computing, any type of workload where you have a lot of jobs that you want to run. And each of these jobs can have their own specification, maybe like an input file or some sort of metadata describes what the job is that you want them to do. And you just want to say, here's 1 million jobs, and provide a cluster to run these jobs to completion. And each of these jobs can be its own container. So we recently announced the integration with Fargate for that. So before, what would happen is AWS batch would have to sort of spend a little bit of time booting up a large EC2 cluster first to start with, and then shutting that down at the end. And you could configure some settings for how long you want to keep the EC2 cluster around and live in case you had more jobs coming in and out. Well, now you don't have to think about anything more. It's actually fully serverless batch computing jobs.
Wow.
That's pretty
scale
crazy.
up, scale up as much as you want on Fargate.
Yeah. Oh man. Yeah. Because there's really no limit. You can, and because of the pay as you go model, you're able to just, you can have 1,000 containers run all in parallel and do whatever you want, or you can have 10 run, in parallel and take a lot longer. It doesn't really matter anymore. That's pretty incredible.
Man,
same either way. So it's just a matter of like, how much time do you want it to take? I don't need this. It can take as long as it needs to.
All right, so let's run through a couple more features, and I think we should probably wrap up. But there was we announced managed node group support with Spot instances. So now I can literally create a managed node group on top of Spot.
I love it.
Yep.
Managed.
Yeah, and we're looking at, and it's on the roadmap, I think, looking at scale to 0 too, which is, I think, great.
Yeah.
So this is more iterating on what makes sense for our customers.
Will Carpenter help with scale to 0? Could you have Carpenter just scale something all the way down to 0?
Based on the rules, yes, because the rules are flexible, and the rules allow you to have multiple weights for different groups. So you could say, hey, this one I always want at 10 or something, and whenever I scale up, scale my Spot ones first or something. So you can have those weights in there as well.
So cool, yeah, awesome.
So, and then just a couple more on the ECS side. So it's like we could literally talk for 8 hours on this,
just
folks.
Keep going.
But we did so. Two things I want to mention. One is we announced circuit breaker support for ECS service deployments. And this is new functionality. It was actually like a pre-invent announcement. And essentially, this is a way now, if you've been using ECS for a while, you have a lot of experience with ECS and CloudFormation, you're building and deploying services. Kind of a pain point at times was if you deployed a broken change, your service would just flap indefinitely. Now with circuit breakers, that service deployment behind the scenes, if you enable circuit breakers, it will detect a failure based on behind the scenes, will determine what that failure threshold is. And it's actually documented in the blog. And then once you hit that threshold, it's going to fail the deployment. The cool thing with this feature, it's in preview, is if you enable automated rollbacks, it will automatically then roll back. Once it's deemed a failure, it'll automatically roll back to the previous healthy deployment of that service, all fully managed within the deployment mechanism there. So if you're using rolling deployments with ECS, check out circuit breakers. It's going to make you very happy.
And this feature is actually great in combination with public gallery, ECR gallery, because if you do have a service that's pulling a public image and it's just failing over and over again, you're going to reach a point where you're eating through your bandwidth. Obviously, that's not something you really want to happen. And even if you were still using Docker Hub instead of ECR public, you'd once again be eating through your quotas on Docker Hub. So now it'll detect within configurable constraints that this has failed to deploy however many times. Let's just go ahead and cancel that deployment and roll back to the one that was working before.
Yeah, that's a good point. Nice.
Yeah, cost.
That's super cool.
It cost out, just saving, not having to keep spinning up resources and not using them. And then, just the overall.
And who among us is not accident? As soon as you see the first failure, you're like in CloudFormation, you're like, oh, I know exactly what I did wrong, but now I'm stuck. Right? I have to wait for CloudFormation to
actually. There's a little hack for that. So what you do is you go into CloudFormation and you set your desired count to 0. Because what the sort of end condition that CloudFormation is actually looking for is for the deployment to reach a stable state.
Right.
It doesn't actually check to make sure that the desired count matches whatever the desired count of the CloudFormation template was. So what you can do is you can set the desired count to 0, and so it'll stabilize to an empty deployment by taking down your service.
But
and then CloudFormation will allow you to advance.
But that'll cause downtime. I would have to take my service down.
Well, if that's the case, you could also manually roll your service back to the previous task definition. But that's not.
And
that's
by the way,
fun.
right? This is what people had to do. So that's been fixed with this, and it's not only been fixed with this, but it's improved the experience now.
Exactly.
Yeah, sometimes we do that. We talk about all the reasons that we build these cool features, and then we talk about them maybe more because we enjoy war stories. But let's keep that in mind. Those are things you don't have to do anymore.
Right. Your life is better now. The last thing I wanted to mention was with capacity providers in ECS. So we recently announced, we've upgraded capacity providers essentially behind the scenes. We've added more functionality. If you're not familiar with capacity providers, it's essentially a way to, if you're managing EC2 instances with your ECS clusters, it has a functionality to take advantage of cluster auto scaling. So when we first released it, there were some limitations. Your auto scaling group, if it spanned multiple availability zones, multiple instance types, the scaling would fall back to like step scaling. Well, now we've actually built in functionality to take those into account, and the scaling algorithm for the cluster will actually be based on the target tracking, which is a much faster scaling process compared to before. So again, great thing about ECS is you get these features, but you didn't have to upgrade anything. It just happened behind the scenes. So
that's awesome. Is there a blog post on the new capacity providers?
I think it's just a what's new post. I couldn't find a blog post. Maybe I'll write one.
Yeah,
I think we're gonna roll it up with some more stuff that's coming down the lines. Like I heard that we were gonna do like per easy capacity consideration and stuff like that. So it's gonna be kind of roll up into here's the latest and greatest for capacity providers.
We should keep
an eye out for that.
Yeah, we should do a show on that for sure. Let's see. Were there some questions that came in? Logging features for pods and EKS. Did we have FireLens? Was that
the Fargate? Yeah, the Fargate pods was new. Where now, if you're running EKS with Fargates, you can enable a FireLens sidecar with just a configuration. You don't need to
hide
car.
Pointing it. Not me. Someone, who was it? Akshay. Yeah, he's going to get full credit for coining the term hide car.
Yeah, so it's a great one. So you deploy your application into Kubernetes just like you normally would. In the past, you used to have to either have like a mutating webhook or something to add the FireLens sidecar inside of your pod. Now, if you're in Fargate, you can in a config map inside of Kubernetes say which namespaces do you want hide cars on, and what's the configuration for FireLens, and that's it.
Where to send the logs.
Any pod you create in that namespace will automatically get a FireLens hide car, so you don't actually see it. If you do kube control, get my pod, you're not going to actually see the container running inside of, like, it's not part of the Kubernetes spec at all, but it can still pull the standard out logs from your container and push it wherever you have FireLens configured. And so that's things like CloudWatch or Datadog, or I think it's like, is it Splunk? And Splunk. I'm missing some other ones.
Kinesis, right?
Kinesis, yeah. I think is S3 there? I don't remember. Whatever FireLens can push, and FireLens is based on Firebit, and so Firebit has a ton of different endpoints. It's not quite the same as FluentBit.
Oh, it's
whole
not. Story.
FluentD is written in Ruby and has a ton of stuff it can do for processing. FluentBit is written in C or C++ and is super minimal. Plugins are smaller. So
yeah, Brent, you and I are the same. We're like Firebit,
right?
FluentBit. It's okay. It's been a long day.
Yeah, it's long day, long show, but. Yeah, got it.
There's even more stuff we could talk about. We have more shows coming.
Yeah, exactly. It might be time to wrap up, actually, because we do have more shows planned and more shows coming. But this, like we said at the very beginning, this was just week 1 of reInvent. So we still have more sessions that are going to be happening during reInvent. If you haven't signed up for reInvent yet, it's not too late. You can still sign up. And today is the first day that the video on demand has been available. So now you can go back and you can watch all the sessions from this week and get caught up over the weekend and be ready to go.
And get the slide decks if you want them, because people
it's also free.
Love those decks.
And it's free. Yes,
it's free.
Good point.
Okay,
awesome.
I'm ready for a nap.
Yeah, no doubt. I think I missed a meeting.
Yeah.
All right. So we'll see everyone next week. And until then, everyone have a great weekend.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.